When a narcissist realizes you refuse to be controlled, they'll do this. There comes a moment in every narcissistic relationship when the dynamic suddenly changes, and that moment is not when you argue harder, explain yourself better, or finally prove your worth to them. The moment everything changes is when the narcissist realizes that you are no longer willing to be controlled, manipulated, or emotionally managed by their behavior. For a narcissist, control is not simply something they enjoy having, but something they depend on to protect their fragile sense of self and maintain their version of reality. As long as they can influence your emotions, dictate your reactions, and keep you questioning yourself, they feel powerful, secure, and in charge of the relationship. But the instant you stop responding the way they expect, something begins to happen beneath the surface that they rarely want anyone to see. The confident image they project starts to crack because your independence threatens the foundation on which their emotional power was built. And when a narcissist realizes you have refused to be controlled, they rarely walk away quietly or accept your freedom with grace. Instead, they often begin a series of predictable behaviors designed to pull you back into the role they need you to play. The first thing many narcissists do is increase the intensity of their manipulation because they assume your resistance is only temporary. They believe that if they apply more pressure, create more confusion, or provoke stronger emotions, you will eventually return to old patterns. This is why many people notice that the narcissist becomes more dramatic, more emotional, and sometimes even more aggressive after losing control. The tactics that once worked effortlessly suddenly stop producing results, and that creates frustration that can quickly turn into desperation. You may notice them picking unnecessary arguments over issues that never mattered before because they are testing whether they can still affect your emotional state. They may criticize you more frequently, challenge your decisions, or deliberately provoke reactions just to see if they still have access to your emotions. What looks like random conflict is often an attempt to regain influence over someone who has started thinking independently. The second thing they often do is play the victim, because victimhood becomes a powerful tool when direct control is no longer effective. Instead of openly demanding obedience, they begin creating stories in which they appear misunderstood, abandoned, or unfairly treated. Suddenly, the person who spent months or years dismissing your feelings begins demanding endless sympathy for their own emotional struggles. This strategy serves two purposes because it shifts attention away from their behavior while making you feel guilty for setting healthy boundaries. Many people fall back into the cycle at this stage because compassion gets confused with responsibility. They start questioning whether they are being too harsh, too distant, or too unforgiving, even though they are simply protecting themselves. The third thing a narcissist often does is attempt to rewrite history because control over the narrative helps them preserve their self-image. Events that happened clearly and repeatedly are suddenly described in completely different ways than you remember. They may deny hurtful actions, minimize serious incidents, or insist that you misunderstood situations that were actually very clear. The goal is not necessarily to convince you of the truth, but to create enough doubt that you stop trusting your own perceptions. A person who doubts themselves becomes much easier to influence than someone who trusts their judgment. This is why your confidence becomes one of the greatest threats to a narcissist who can no longer control you. The fourth thing they often do is recruit other people into the situation because outside validation helps compensate for lost influence. Friends, family members, coworkers, or even strangers may suddenly hear a version of the story that paints them as the innocent party. The narcissist hopes that social pressure will succeed where direct manipulation has failed. If enough people question your choices, criticize your boundaries, or encourage reconciliation, they believe you may eventually give in. This behavior is rarely about resolving conflict and is usually about rebuilding control through indirect channels. The fifth thing they do is become unexpectedly charming because they recognize that force is not always the most effective strategy. The same person who recently criticized, ignored, or devalued you may suddenly become affectionate, attentive, and understanding. Many people become confused during this stage because the narcissist appears to have changed overnight. But temporary kindness often arrives not because they respect your boundaries, but because they fear losing access to you completely. The affection is designed to remind you of the version of them you always hoped would stay. They know that emotional memories can be powerful enough to make people overlook ongoing patterns of behavior. The sixth thing they often do is test your boundaries repeatedly because they need to know whether your changes are permanent. The tests may seem small and insignificant at first glance, but they reveal important information about your resolve. They might send casual messages, make unexpected appearances, or create situations that require your attention. Each interaction becomes an opportunity to measure whether they can still influence your decisions and emotions. What matters is not the size of the test, but your willingness to maintain the boundary despite discomfort. Every time you remain consistent, you communicate something the narcissist does not want to hear. You communicate that your peace matters more than their approval, and that your identity no longer depends on their validation. That realization can be deeply unsettling for someone who built their power around controlling how others think and feel. The seventh thing they often do is become angry when all other strategies fail, because anger frequently emerges when entitlement meets resistance. A narcissist who believes they should have unlimited access to your time, energy, and attention may see boundaries as a personal attack. What you experience as self-respect, they may interpret as rejection or defiance. This anger is not proof that your boundaries are wrong, but evidence that they are disrupting a system that once benefited them. The stronger your independence becomes, the more obvious it becomes that their old methods are losing effectiveness. And that is exactly why maintaining your boundaries is so important during this stage. When someone has spent years controlling others, they often expect resistance to collapse eventually. They count on exhaustion, guilt, loneliness, and self-doubt to bring people back into familiar patterns. But every day you remain committed to your growth, you weaken the influence those tactics once had over your life. The most powerful thing you can understand is that a narcissist's reaction to losing control is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their inability to accept a relationship that is built on equality instead of dominance. Healthy people may feel disappointed when boundaries are set, but they ultimately learn to respect them. Narcissists often react differently because boundaries expose the limits of their influence and challenge the image they have of themselves. That is why refusing to be controlled can trigger such dramatic responses. You are not simply changing a relationship dynamic, but removing access to a source of emotional power they once took for granted. And when they finally realize that you are serious, that you are no longer available for manipulation, and that you genuinely trust yourself, something remarkable happens. The control they once had begins to disappear, and the freedom you thought you had lost starts returning to you piece by piece. The moment a narcissist realizes they can no longer control you may be uncomfortable, emotional, and challenging. But it is also the moment you begin reclaiming your voice, your confidence, and your ability to define your own life. Because the greatest threat to a narcissist is not revenge, anger, or confrontation. The greatest threat is a person who finally sees the game clearly and chooses not to play anymore.